In the description of your course, you mention the focus as the relationship between affectivity and discursive validity. Could you explain what you mean by that?
Sure. So for ancient and medieval people, when they think of human consciousness, they think of two things. They think of apprehension and apprehending. So that's coming to know or understand, and desiring. And so affectivity is a way of indicating that the desiring side of human consciousness, and valid discursivity, which means logically consistent from premises that are shared and thought to be true. And it's basically a syllogistic way of thinking from one thing to the other and relating one thing to another.
So in this tension between thinkers, are there thinkers that jump out at you as being particularly on opposite sides, like emphasizing the affectivity or the discursive validity?
Sure, there are thinkers that really are very obviously working with what Pierre Hadot calls philosophy as an art of right living. And they are often working through affectivity because affectivity is the principle of motion, so to speak, in a human being, at least as they understood it. In other words, it's desire that sets you in motion, whether it's desire for or desire for the opposite, for the absence of X. It's in that sense that when philosophy is understood as a formation to a certain kind of life, so an exploration of and a formation to a certain kind of life, those will be the people that tend to be on one side of things. Isocrates is really one of the most obvious examples from the ancient world. From the medieval world, somebody like Bernardus Sylvestris, who's not a household name, but is very big in the 12th century. And in the modern world, there's so many playful contemporary and postmodern philosophers who are less interested in a kind of systematic representation of the order of the world and are more about, say, somebody like Jean-Paul Sartre, about how to live as a person, transcending the in-selfness of objects and blah, blah, blah. So you have those on the one side, and then the great systematicians on the other, who, if they're modern and contemporary, are really taken with the science ideal of representing the order of X, so the order of human consciousness in its interaction with the world. And if one's working in an earlier period, somebody like an Aristotelian, like the Spanish Muslim Aristotelian of Heloise, or that's not his actual name, Ibn Rushd. The Aristotelian tradition tends to be more on the, as it were, scientific or apprehensive side. So it's about apprehending things in an order that's fundamentally a logical order. And you have a host of people for whom logic is a mode of persuasion. So in other words, they're operating by rhetorical principles that have affect as really what they've got in their sights, because the point is to set people in motion toward a form of living that represents a kind of excellence in human existence.
So while none of the thinkers you discussed throughout the course are contemporary, are there any thinkers or thoughts in the course that strike you as particularly pertinent?
Yeah, so right up into the contemporary era. So as long as, especially in Europe, where gymnasium education is fundamentally the Renaissance classical project, logicians are also rhetors. They're trained to both and trained equally. And so historically, they not only view their texts as scientific representations of the way things are and the order between things, but also as instances of persuasion, because representation is an important persuasive moment, but it is not itself an obvious way to affect the desire that sets you in motion. Texts that we just assume to be scientific in character, if you read the philosopher, Cicero, say, or somebody like that, in a sense, these representations are means to an end, which is how to live. How can we live?
And this relationship between affectivity and discursive validity. Do you see that as a tension that continues on to the present day? And does anything come to mind as being particularly representative of that tension in our day?
If you think of philosophical controversies around Richard Rorty are a pragmatist is by definition a rhetor. He has to persuade because there are no conceptual or metaphysical foundations that he or she can appeal to. So you have to persuade. So the pragmatistic tradition in English-speaking philosophy is an instance of rhetorical philosophers, whether they ever use that word or not. They just have to do this because you don't have philosophical foundations that you can appeal to that are a priori. And their opponents are very often very logicistic thinkers who think that there is a foundation in human thought that is an absolute foundation that you can appeal to, or they have a metaphysics.
If none of the thinkers you discuss write explicitly about our moment, why should we read them when we could be reading contemporary thinkers, contemporary commentators?
Contemporary thinkers are in philosophy are saturated with the history of philosophy. They're not only interacting with the conundra that we face in contemporary society and life, but they have this history of philosophy that's, you might say, a lumber room of thought methods, arguments, claims, intuitions about the world that they've been schooled to in their formation as philosophers. So that's one reason. And the second reason is rhetoric for now a generation and a half have not been taught seriously in the schools anymore. And so we're not nearly as self-conscious and we're not nearly as schooled about how we assemble texts to persuade, but we do. So to look at the ancient and medieval and early modern thinkers who are very self-consciously trying to persuade and using the full gamut of tools that the rhetorical tradition explored since before Plato and Aristotle to help one persuade, it allows you then to look at texts in their persuasive moment and go, oh, this is going on. Oh, this is going on. So when ICS used to have a senior member in political theory and a whole bunch of students that came to study with him, when they took this course, immediately political rhetoric came to the surface for them. And they just found all these rhetorical tools just incredibly helpful for understanding what's going on in contemporary political speech and discourse. In fact, I remember one paper I got was from a student who looked at Robert Kennedy's speech after the death of Martin Luther King as an attempt to persuade. And what is he doing? And why does it work? Why do you get goosebumps when you read it? And so on. This is what the rhetors help you with. And this is not something that you get schooled to anymore. You used to, even into the beginning of the 20th century, but not anymore.